I'm an epidemiologist by training, which is not a skin doctor. It is, I work with epidemics, and obviously substance abuse is the epidemic that we're talking about here. It's a pandemic, it's global. But I really focus on intergenerational trauma is my area. I'm also trained as a midwife way back when, and so I tend to think about this intergenerationally all the way from field development and a field called epigenetics, which some of you are maybe familiar with. And we'll talk a little bit about that, and we'll also really try to talk about the action of the drug so that we understand why this happens, and it's not just social environments, but I do want to have us look at this on a larger scope. The reason I worked with WHO is World Health Organization is I also do a lot of work in West Africa and in the Middle East. And so for the last 2003, 2004, I was working with UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commission on Refugees. And I was based in Kuwait working in Iraq with Iraqi displaced persons. And what we saw then relevant to substance use is that we saw a lot of drugs coming up from Afghanistan into the Middle East, where they have huge substance abuse problems. Definitely not very Islamic, and a big problem for them in many ways to try to deal with the treatment issues. But also, I really encountered a lot of our military. So how many in the room have worked with veteran treatment courts at all? Okay, great. Because I think our veterans have new challenges, and therefore their families have new challenges. And the National Guard is a big population throughout our country that has really been impacted differentially in these last 10 years. So I've been working quite a bit, not only with our own military, but with other militaries around the world to try to deal with this problem, because substance use is pretty prominent in that population, and then moves into the families and moves into their civilian communities when they come back. So something I also want to talk about here a little bit, and how trauma, which is really my real interest, oftentimes leads to substance use. Some trauma one or another ways is one of the things that really moves people into substance use. So I really want us to understand substance use disorders, which is the phrase that we now are using, SUDS, right, for use, abuse, and disorders. The relationship between traumatic exposures and its impact on families and communities, and really the psychopharmacology of it overall. I realize at the back of the room you can't see this necessarily, but maybe some of you up front can, and don't give it away then. These are the relative risks of various substances that are all the way from economic costs, environmental costs, which there actually are. You guys all know that with meth labs for sure, and physical costs in general. Anybody want to take a guess as to what, I don't know if I've got a little pointer here or not, this tallest one is over here on the side? What would that be? This really big one, folks. This one. Yeah. Is that because you read it or because you just knew it? Absolutely. Alcohol is really has a huge impact on our societies overall. I was really pleased to hear Jeff's kind of impassioned talk about alcohol as one of the leading issues, and it certainly overlaps with a lot of our other substances of abuse. Heroin is the next one, crack cocaine and methamphetamine, and then cocaine, and it goes down. But mushrooms are on the end, although they're making a comeback in certain places. But I think that talking about alcohol is going to be important for all of us to think about the psychoactivity of it and how it impacts other drugs as well. So what you're doing here is not just isolated to Montana, obviously. This is really a national issue. It's a global health problem. And I think that that's the way we need to think about it now. Obviously, you're pretty close, at least some of you are pretty close to Canada. I worked for a long time, in fact, established what are called drug endangered children response teams, DAC teams, multidisciplinary teams that work with kids found in meth labs in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, and I've worked a lot with the BME and DEA around how we can do what I call therapeutic arrests. I don't think that's how our SWAT teams thought of it, but that was really sort of how I thought we needed to think about doing really good interventions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But working with law enforcement, working with the judicial system, working with our treatment communities therapeutically and globally is really, I think, what we need to be doing now. The U.S. leads the way in a lot of our prescription opioids. We've led the way on psychotropic medication use for a long time. And I'm going to ask another question. How many of you intersect with the child welfare system at all? A few. Okay, a few. Do any of you work in family drug treatment courts? Some? No? Okay. Because psychotropic medication use oftentimes starts in our foster care systems, right? I mean, our kids are heavily, heavily over-medicated in foster care. And we have 2-year-olds being diagnosed with bipolar disorders and being put on unbelievable cocktails, really. And so I would encourage you, if you do interact with these courts at all, that you help them to make sure that they have a psychotropic medication protocol on board. Because this starts early and it kind of goes globally, and we have exported a lot of our pharmaceuticals to other countries as well, such that now Australia is trailing us in terms of our global drug use and other substances. So globally, 1 out of 10 drug users suffer from dependence. One of the biggest changes that is happening here that is probably going to impact a lot of us is the legalization of cannabis, of marijuana. It will be legalized, I'm pretty sure, in November in California. While I am not, and I imagine none of us in this room are really interested in criminalization of drug use, I think that this is probably a wrong-minded approach to take. I think it minimizes the harm that we see with the really heavy THC content, and I hope that we can try to counter that with some education still. But it is a problem that is going to be affecting us globally as we see more and more people fall into this sort of situation of cannabis disorders. What's important about thinking about the family is that the families are never neutral, right? They are never meaningless. They either support recovery or they hinder it. Even if people have theoretically burned bridges, there are sometimes ways to restore it, or the families and support structures are always really, really important. So there's strong evidence that working with the families at all generations makes a big difference. It's the reason I do like to work with juvenile and family courts as well as our criminal courts, as long as we bring the families in. I'm going to ask you, how many of you on your criminal treatment court face pages or intake pages have a question about family members? Any of you? Great. That is really great. So what do you ask? Do you ask who is there or who's...
We ask, like, if they're close, are they supportive? Do you have, like, everything pretty open? Like, what kind of issues do you have with that?
Do you ask about children or kids in the family, or...
That is actually one of the data collection pieces we use in Montana that all of us have to settle that some kids are home or not at the home.
Right, that's great. Because I think that's where we really need to lead our thinking, is we need to think about the intergenerational aspects. The parents are affected, the children are affected. And as we think about this globally, we're not going to solve this as a problem if we're really targeting on sort of tier by tier. If we're taking all of our 14-year-olds and moving them forward, or dealing with all of our 30-year-olds, if we're not really dealing with that entire continuum of age spans that they're affecting, their parents, their siblings, and their children. And we know for sure that there's a huge genetic component, right, in chemical dependency. So we need to be addressing these risk factors and making sure that we're really looking at how we can impact the next generation and move us forward progressively. You probably can't really see this very well, so I apologize. But basically it just says that schools are a place to intervene, the family itself, individuals, and then the media. And the media is still a huge place where we need to be aware of what's going on and really be active about it. I will get into psychopharmacology in a minute. I'm just going to be on my bandstand for a second here. But a few years ago, we had Anheuser-Busch, in Van Nuys, which is near where I live in Santa Monica, California. And they did a little preview with people that were in the alcohol and drug community treatment programs to see how a possible beer that was going to be fortified with calcium would sell. And they were going to be selling it to Self magazine which apparently is a women's health magazine. And they had this picture of this kind of buff person, like all running like this, knocking back, and the next person, she was like running and all sweaty, right? And the next picture, she's knocking back. Sophie's was the name of the beer, and it had your daily requirement of calcium in it. So they were going to be advertising it, and it obviously, thank goodness, they ran it by a lot of people. We really were outraged by it, but it was being marketed, and there were some women's groups that were saying, well, yeah, women are drinking, this is a niche market. We should be able to, at least have it have calcium added. Why wouldn't this be a good thing? And does anybody think that would be a good thing to be I really worry about it being, advertised already as, wine coolers to our 14-year-olds and things like that. But I think we need to be much more aware of the impact of the social media on us and on our clients, and how that really impacts what messages they're getting about the acceptability of the substances, because we're doing all sorts of work, but we're really not addressing these subliminal issues that are getting under their skins and are making a big difference in how our society moves into this. So you probably are all aware, just to remind us, this is actually still a sea change. I've been working in this field now for 30-some years, not because I'm a masochist, but because, like you, I had although some days, right, we all think, well, what are we doing? But it's because we've seen people change. But at the time, most of the substance use treatment programs were really run by former addicts, former chemically dependent people who were absolutely opposed to anything like medication-assisted treatment, right? We had no MAT because people really wanted abstinence. They didn't want anything to do with drugs. We still have some resistance to that. We really didn't have any really good brain imaging techniques, so people did not accept still at that time that many of you are way too young to remember these days, but people did not accept that this was a disease. This really was a moral failing. So this is a huge step forward, and it's what we're going to talk about today is how the brain adapts to this and why some of us are more vulnerable to it than others. And I think this is informative for each of us, but also for our clients to understand. They really can understand this psychopharmacology. What we know for sure is that this is a dopamine pathway, right? The dopamine has been called the master molecule of addiction. This affects the limbic system throughout the brain. Dopamine is just one of more than 100 neurotransmitters that connect our pathways to our brain, mostly in the white tissue, which is all of our pathways and all the axonal nexons. It affects movement, gait ataxia, for example. The reason why people have Parkinson's is it impacts their dopamine systems as well. So some of you may have seen people that have been methamphetamine induced and they look like they have Parkinson's. Especially we've had a lot of ice problems in Hawaii over time, and they have that kind of really shaky gait, and we're worried that we may see early onset of Parkinson's in some of this population because of the dopamine depletion that happens in their systems. But these are all really connected. And dopamine is not just located in one part of the brain, but it is sort of throughout. The brain is activated. For pathway addictive drugs, there are specific areas in the brain that are more affected than others, but it really is diffuse. And for example, serotonin is another substance we'll talk about later, but it's not just in the brain. Serotonin is in fact heavily, serotonin receptors are heavily in our gastrointestinal tract, right? So we have many of these dopamine and neurotransmitter receptor sites throughout our body, and the brain is like the main one that's affected. Dopamine action is basically, it's a loop, and we're going to spend a little more time on this, but our brains are very efficient. They generate dopamine and they release it into the internerval areas, and where dopamine receptors then pick it up, and then it's picked up and taken back and recycled essentially. What the drugs do is they stay in the system longer, they shut down the receptors, and you have this huge flood of dopamine staying there, and therefore it stays in the brain for much longer. And we can see what happens when methamphetamine, for example, is the main one, where it stays for a very long period of time in our brain for up to 18 hours after even just one dose. When I came into town here, I was under the impression that you did have a lot of opiate problems throughout Montana. However, on my way over here this morning on an Uber, the Uber driver sort of just spontaneous, I asked him what the economic status was in Billings and what people sort of did here. And he began talking a lot about methamphetamine as sales, as his own family being affected, as a big challenge. So maybe you guys can just fill me in a little bit more. Are you still having meth labs in this area, or home-based methamphetamine production? Okay, I'm seeing some people shake their heads no. So is it variable across the state, or?
Statistically, it went from about 200 10 years ago in the Billings, Yellowstone County area down to like one
lab.
But we had, until it's reduced more recently, we had an oil field boom in North Dakota.
Okay, right.
And so we were sort of in the pathway of transporting that.
Okay.
It comes from us.
Okay. But
the pathway came through Billings. At one time, it was like second to agriculture, and now it's coming from the other direction. It's coming out of Iowa and Wisconsin into North Dakota.
But you're not dealing with a lot of precursor chemicals, or you are? I mean, you're still getting
Not so much anymore.
home-based. Okay, that's
Availability is the same.
and it's still pretty high content or high purity. Okay, so that is too bad, because it is a difficult drug to treat, as you know, and it does in fact stimulate dopamine and maintain it in the brain for a very long time. Part of the reason that we know all this now is because we have the capacity to image the brains in live time. So what you see here essentially is, and I'm going to be just simplistic about it, but what you see here in the middle section, and this is probably really relevant for drug court context, is in the red section you have a normal release of dopamine into the brain. Sort of a shorthand, the area around the red fluorescence of dopamine in the brain is sort of where you would have short-term memories being formed, where you would have cognition taking place. It's not in the prefrontal lobe, so it's not actually the judgment areas, but you would begin to get memories being formed in those areas. During drug use, you have this huge burst of dopamine, which means this person is feeling very, very good, right? They're having all sorts of pleasurable sensations. And not only are they feeling good physically, but they're perceiving themselves as articulate, witty, sexy, brilliant. You know, it's really a positive self-image. So people find it very attractive, right? That sounds like a very good appealing drug. But commensurately, what you see there is that cognition is shutting down. Short-term memories are not being formed. It's impinging on other parts of the brain's capacity to actually remember things and to begin to develop ideas. During addiction, you have not only a complete cessation, this anhedonia of the dopamine is just going to zero production. And part of the reason for that is that when the dopamine is produced, it not only is making the dopamine be generated, but all sorts of other things are happening to the body. You have cardiac increase, blood pressure increase, and one of the other things that happens is you get peripheral shutdown of the circulatory system. And so you'll have sort of shutting down other kinds of functions. And one of the things that happens in the field that I'm particularly interested in is during pregnancy. The impact of that is that the fetus is not essential for that human survival. So you'll have a fetal impact. And if any of you were in the earlier session this morning around addictive, around use of prescription drugs, and addiction of prescription drugs. And she mentioned that there's a lot of fetal impact. And indeed, you'll see the fetus having hypoxic episodes. The lack of oxygen is getting to there's no oxygen getting to the fetus. You'll have brain damage for sometimes to the fetus. Oftentimes, you'll see that the fetus at that point is passing a stool, right? All of you are familiar with meconium. Have you heard of meconium? So meconium is the first stool that a newborn typically passes after delivery. But just like you, when you get upset or anxious, you shit. If you get you poop your pants, right? You get really upset, and that's what happens when you're really super stressed. And that's what happens to the fetus, is they actually have a bowel movement into the amniotic fluid because they get really stressed. There's not a lot of oxygen. They get very active. And you can either have, depending on the stage of the pregnancy and how far along the fetus is, you can end up having a spontaneous abortion, or you'll end up with having some problems that can affect the entire fetus in terms of brain damage or other issues. But when the meconium goes into the amniotic fluid, what you see then happening is when the baby is born, they may aspirate, they take the first breath going through the pelvic canal, and they gasp, and it sets up a respiratory distress infection, and they end up in the hospital. And that really is because you're seeing this situation where you've got lots of dopamine on board, which is shutting down the rest of the physiologic system of that host, of that maternal compartment. So addiction is not only affecting this individual, but affecting the next generation and traumatizing that unborn at that point.
Excuse me.
Yes.
So I have significant numbers of mothers who really just think that THC doesn't fit into all of their components. It's a completely separate animal. And I haven't tried to create. I searched for any kind of really statistically significant information that states how harmful THC can be during pregnancy and during nursing. There hasn't been as much lately, but THC definitely, and what we definitely know, and there's very good data on, is that it reduces birth weight. So you have what's called small for gestational age. So you may have a baby that, there's two things. You might have premature baby, which is born early, and then you may also have small for gestational age, or very low birth weight. It definitely affects the weight gain, and it affects all sorts of other, basically neuromotor composites of the children. So therefore, they're oftentimes born with poor sucks. They're not able to actually nurse very well because they can't latch on. They don't come to mid in the same way that a lot of this, basically drugs across the board, prenatally affect, and alcohol especially, actually. It's the only drug that's a teratogen here. But it affects how kids come to midline. So this is like a really complicated thing that you all do when you're stressed out as you get into a fetal position. I realize I'm deviating a little bit from this addiction. We're going to have to get on track here in a minute. But this is an important question, is that you all kind of do, when you're stressed out, you get back to this sort of fetal position, you come to midline, which is a very complicated right-left brain activity. Knowing how to suck, knowing how to self-soothe, actually sucking one's thumb as a newborn is a huge self-soothing behavior, and it's pretty complicated. A lot of these kids don't do that. They splay, and they don't put if you put your hand around there, they won't grasp it. They can't do that. So you need to swaddle them really tightly. This is true for most substances. THC is no different, actually. And the low birth weight means that it means that they may have a poorer chance of good nutrition when they're born. They may have slower development. Their developmental trajectory may not be straight up on the curve. But rather than sort of shame parents or freak them out completely, the important thing to know about these adverse fetal experiences is that birth is not a landmark for brain development. This is a really good thing. The reason we're born at 9 months typically is because you wouldn't be able to get the head out of the birth canal if it got any bigger, right? You guys already know this. It's a little bit stressful as it is, and so the head, I mean, if you look at a kid, if I draw this picture, or I draw this picture, you know immediately which one is a child and which one is an adult, right? This kid with the big eyes and the big head is a big-headed kid. And eventually the body will grow up, to be proportionate with the head. But the brain and the head are very big at delivery, and then the brain continues to grow. Now what doesn't continue to grow, and this is where THC and smoking are bad, is the lungs. And so the lungs actually are very compromised, especially if you're born early. We need to use something called surfactant. to help the lungs mature, and so these kids are in the NICU and costing a lot of money and are at much greater risk for upper respiratory diseases, are much greater risk for asthma. And if they're in an environment where they're smoking or secondhand smoke around, then they can end up with a lot of big challenges. So I'm happy to get you some literature on the THC, but I definitely want to put it to rest that that's not accurate. And of course, I would totally understand why they would want to reject that idea, right? That it would be harmful, and you don't want to feel guilty over harm that you potentially, affected. And I think why it's important to know that harm is there, but it doesn't have to be forever. You can spend a lot of time on developmental supports to really make a difference. So, didn't mean to completely get off on that. However, I think it's worth mentioning that when we're looking at someone who is chemically dependent, even if there's not another person there, if there's a pregnant woman standing in front of you, she is having an impact on another life. And it's really important to get her treatment. I am not at all into the concept of fetal abuse. I think it's really important that we understand that this is a disease and everybody needs treatment, including that child. And we know that I used to work at Martin Luther King Hospital during the crack epidemic in the early 80s, and we had so many babies born with skull fractures and broken clavicles and broken scapulas because the abdomen was the target of abuse. And the father was trying to discipline the mother because she'd been using drugs. Of course, he was usually her dealer, and to try to prevent her from harming their child. And so he beat her up, right? So domestic violence is a real problem for a lot of these women, and it's a problem for the unborn child as well. If that mother, whatever happens, the placental barrier is very thin. So a lot of things actually do get through that barrier to the fetus, and it's important for us to recognize also, which we'll get to in a minute, that a lot of our parents were those children, right? 16, 20, 30 years ago, right? So we have a lot of intergenerational impact that we see going on in this population, I believe. So what I want to mention, I will get to it, I'm going to finish this slide, I promise, really, after 25 minutes. Sidebar. This is a methamphetamine case, and in this case, what you see is important to notice. And I'm not sure how well this shows it, but what you see is a restoration of some dopamine production, but it appears that we never really get back to the full dopamine production that we started with. So what are the implications of that? Okay, if dopamine makes us feel good, I use drugs, probably not because I'm feeling the best, right? I don't start, and once you become chemically dependent, you don't typically end up feeling a lot better. And then now you're in recovery, 12 months of treatment, and now you're not producing the dopamine that you started out before you used. What's the implications of that for all of you that are working in treatment? Pardon? Depression. And what happens with depression oftentimes? Relapse, right? Okay. And at this point, so, I would love to, I'm going to have to jump forward. Well, here, I'm going to go back. So cocaine is a great example of this. The slide you saw before was amphetamine. But cocaine, stimulants you can see this best with because they tend to produce dopamine the most quickly, right? So you see the anhedonia, which was the dopamine depletion, right? That's the anhedonia is right here, lack of failure to feel good. And so how that translates for a lot of us is that if, let's say I'm a child protective services worker, I've just taken your kid away, for some reason little Johnny isn't totally furious with you, and we go meet at McDonald's, and Johnny comes running up to you and says, "Mommy, it's so good to see you." And you say, "Hi, Johnny. Great to see you too." You have no affect, you don't run to him, you don't take pleasure out of those interactions. And the social worker writes down no contact, no bonding, doesn't care, right? Not engaged, right? Well, this mother or this father, whoever this is, does not have the capacity to feel joy, right? All of us like to think we're all fabulous people, and I'm sure you all are. It's all your great temperaments that make you all so wonderful, but actually we're chemical factories at some level. I'm not discounting the spiritual aspect, but we're really dependent
on our neurotransmitters and our dopamine and our serotonin levels. And guess what? Not all of us are born equally. We don't all have the same chemical makeup. And what makes us who we are? Our parents, our grandparents, our genealogy. So our whole collective genetic gene pool is what ends up determining what our melange is of our little neurotransmitter pool that we have to draw from. So what you see is that initially you have this euphoria, you all know this, the effects are fabulous. You then end up with anxiety. This is with, especially with methamphetamine, where you can end up with really, where you're not eating, you're having all sorts of serious problems, you're paranoid, you're aggressive. And I just want to sort of follow up on, I was hoping you were going to grow, Shelley. Follow up on the analogy I began to give you of all of us not being equal. So Shelley is at the top of this bar here. I don't know if you can see this on the left-hand side. Dopamine production is on the left, and time is on the bottom. And I'm on the bottom. So normally, Shelley goes home from work, and she finds that she got a letter saying that she has been given a week off with pay. Bonuses, and someone's going to do the work while she's gone. So she's very happy, and she has this little dopamine surge, and then she gets back to normal, so that she can go about her business. She can go enjoy her vacation, she can have her oil changed in her car, she can go grocery shopping, she can do the functional things that she needs to do. So dopamine is a good thing as long as we come back to a resting place, get back to baseline. Now, somebody puts cocaine in her Coca-Cola, which, of course, this would happen to all of our clients, right? They would never do it themselves. It's just they have no idea how I got there. It's a dirty test, but it's not possible. And so she has this rush. If it's cocaine or crack, and if it's crack, it might be different, right? But pretty much the same, roughly. So she has this high, but then, because there was too much dopamine put out in between her receptors and neurotransmitters, her system begins to take it offline right away because our brain is an efficient factory. So there's too much dopamine out here. Let's pull some of the dopamine offline, which is how you got to a place where there was no dopamine being produced, right? You had to pull it offline. So now she's dropped down to a lower bar of dopamine production at a baseline. Now, if somebody gets their methamphetamine, again, you have this huge rush, and it persists for a long period of time, just even with one dose. Meth is just that much more intense, and therefore that much more quickly capable of making you dependent. Right? Your brain associates it in that set association that really sets you up right away. And you drop down further in terms of no dopamine production, because there's way too much dopamine on board, and it's really setting you off balance. So the brain is adapting. It says, oh, wow, holy cow, there's a lot of dopamine here. I don't need to make so much. It's very adaptive. Our brains are trying to restore equilibrium. But if this happens over a period of time, after Shelley ends up liking methamphetamine way too much, she gets down to a place where she's not producing any dopamine. And that's that anhedonia that you saw. Now, so she's got little to no dopamine, creates an anhedonia. Same thing happens with Kathleen. Okay? I'm in the same boat. Our baseline after, a new baseline after 18 to 24 months of treatment means that we're going to be much reduced in our dopamine production. And now, if I relapse again, my baseline is going to drop even further. So the challenge for all of you is relapse prevention planning, right? And I know you've had sessions on that, but from day one, in your treatment plan, you really need to be schooling people on relapse prevention planning. Because relapse is likely to happen, right? That's part of the disease. We haven't gotten to that dialogue, but you all know that. And so this is the biological reason. So one of the questions I want to ask you is, why are Shelley and I so different? Why do we start out with that different baseline dopamine? She's starting out with a high baseline dopamine. I'm starting out with a low one. Why would that be? Absolutely. So you begin to look at my parents and my grandparents, and you see some mental health problems, you see previous substance abuse issues. So you look at that family front page, and your family history. Risk factors are previous histories of substance use yourself or in your family. My grandmother did happen to be an alcoholic. My husband's father was a very high-functioning alcoholic. My grandmother didn't get into treatment, pretty much died in a state asylum, with shame and divorce and the whole thing, because this was in the 30s, 40s. My father-in-law, high-functioning economist, actually director of Office of Budget and Management in the Kennedy and Johnson administration and all that, he was lauded, just like all of our clients are, right? He said, oh, it's so brave of you to go into treatment, Bill. Right? He went into a treatment program where they had massages and swimming pools, and clearly it wasn't publicly funded, right? And he got into treatment. He did well, but it was a real difference in how those problems are. But my children, I have to say to my 3 sons, I say to them, you have got this background, and probably knowing what we know about our population in this country, there are probably not very many of you that can say you don't know anyone in your family, whether it's a cousin or someone somewhere that has a chemical dependency problem. And whether that's tobacco or alcohol or illicit drugs, it's really an epidemic. It's endemic at this point. It's part of our culture. And in some communities, our Native American community, our First Peoples around the world have just been decimated with this problem. And so it's really a huge genetic issue. And I want to ask you also, given Kathleen's high baseline of dopamine and given Kathleen's low baseline, who do you think is more likely to become chemically dependent more quickly? And we're both going to see some of the same aspects, but who might move from this state over here to this state over here, or maybe even this first use. Who's going to go more quickly from one to the other, do you think? Okay. Why?
Because she's already more depressed.
Okay. You could hear it. She's already more depressed, and she probably is likely to say, oh my goodness, I had no idea you could feel like this, right? And so it's not that we don't have a lot of substance use, right, across the board. But some people don't fall into complete abject dependency, and others are much more quickly likely to fall into it. Now, there's a lot of environmental aspects as well. We know that there's nature and nurture is really this new science of what we call epigenetics, that we actually see changes in how genes are expressed and when genes are turned on and off. It has to do with exposures to traumas and insults, which if we have time, I'll get to that. But we do know that gene pools can actually be changed, and that it's probably more likely that she already has some issues and she may already have some needs to be feeling good. So absolutely. So we know that behavioral changes happen, subconscious control takes over, these become habitual habits, and people don't recognize when they don't recognize that they see their dealer's blue van. They begin to salivate, and they are already down that path, right? So they don't make that connection. They don't stop it right away and say, "Oh my goodness, I just saw my dealer's blue van on the corner of my eye. All of a sudden having a craving." They don't make that connection and stop it right then. They're off and running, and that's what sets them off, right? In fact, there was a study at the University of Pennsylvania that brought people into a lab where they showed them pictures of money and all sorts of scenes, etc. These were people that were chemically dependent on, I think it was cocaine at the time. And after a while, and they hooked them up with monitors, indeed, they found them salivating, blood pressure elevated, cardiac elevation. Finally, when they got them in the car to take them to the University of Pennsylvania lab, they started their triggers because they knew that they were going to be seeing all these things. So they began backing it up, and the associations of the drug use that was going to happen at the end of this trial just got even that much more intense. So the cravings didn't get shut down; they actually started sooner, as they associated even the research assistant with ultimately the dosing from it. So these are relapse prevention is a huge path that we need to work with, right? And this is all really happening at a neurobiologic level, right? This is the amygdala and the hippocampus are being triggered to say go. The frontal cortex gets shut down, which is where you have the capacity, which is why in all sorts of instances, it's shutting down, whether you want to yell at your kid or whether you want to hit the television while you're watching one of the debates this year, or whether you are thinking about using drugs. You have to just say, okay, I'm just going to count to 10, because that counting to 10 gives you a chance to actually think and that's engaging your prefrontal cortex instead of going back to your brainstem and letting your thinking capacity take over. And of course, that's what cognitive behavioral therapy gets us to do. Just as an awareness of this is really a summary. Environmental cues trigger craving. The next cues, the brain responds differently. It's already been, can already have this increased tolerance. Ultimately, if you change that, then you can have an overdose. The relapse prevention requires planning and forethought. Cognitive functioning is impaired. And brain recovery takes time, and especially for meth and cocaine, it can be up to 12 months. These are all sorts of things that you see with NIDAS. This is just a summary of increased tolerance to drugs and abuse. And at one time, this was very controversial. We know now for sure that there is an enormous genetic predisposition. And that does not mean that it is a done deal. What's really important about that, it means that, from my point of view, from a public health perspective, those families that have chemical dependency problems in the adults or in the grandparents, that's the population that you want to concentrate on. So if you have a client in your treatment court, why would you ever think of not treating that whole family? You need to just dump resources onto those children, onto those extended family members, onto the siblings. That is a marker that you've got a real population there that's going to be at risk, and especially if they're being parented by someone who's got a drug problem or an alcohol problem. They're likely to have not only the genetics, but they're going to have the environmental triggers that are going to push them into big challenges. So this is great that you guys are doing all these things. I was really impressed that Montana has 32 drug courts, which is phenomenal. California really doesn't even have that many that are up and running. And as real formal drug courts, we have what are called collaborative courts, which is slightly different. But they obviously increase success. So just wanted to just do a quick recap on this. So just to make sure that we're all still awake after a few minutes after lunch, that neurotransmitter levels of other disorders typically do what after a person goes to recovery? Seem to return to baseline, seem to never return to baseline, seem to increase above baseline levels. Which one is right? B. What do you think? It's B, actually, okay? They really, as far as we know, they actually don't go back to baseline. We haven't seen them really return to baseline. And so that's a problem. That is part of the reason why this is a chronic, ongoing disease, right? It's people are really having to struggle with this usually most of their lives, all of their lives. So the implications of this are that a relapse prevention plan is in place. Other mental health issues may emerge when a person achieves abstinence. Multiple major relapses make permanent recovery, abstinence difficult, or all of the above.
All the above.
Yeah, okay, D. And so that's where what you also see are, I don't know your program enough well enough here, but do you have some sessions on co-occurring disorders? Okay, great, because obviously you're going to be seeing co-occurring disorders. Mental health and depression and anxiety disorders are going back and forth, and it's really hard to know which is the chicken and the egg sometimes, right? I mean, you're in a situation where you're chemically depressed, and you're also in a situation where you're, which one comes first is hard. So it really does require checking in. One of the important things to know also, though, is that when a person is in the thick of their chemical dependency, they may not have the receptors available to pick up antidepressant medications. So there needs to be some level of abstinence, or at least some moving into some sort of level of treatment before the SSRIs or the other anti-anxiety and antidepressant medications can work fully or work as well as you might want them to. So that's an important piece. So the drug types that we're going to spend a little time talking about here are alcohol, which are depressants, pain relief, stimulants, hallucinogens, and then the cannabinoids. This is the most frequently abused drug in the world. It is the leading cause of mental retardation in the developed world. It is involved in most cases, about 80% of cases of domestic violence, and it's present with most other drugs of abuse. Right now, there are some villages in southern Africa where there's fabulous vineyards. If any of you have been looking at some of the great wines from South Africa, and a lot of the workers there are paid with alcohol chips. They're paid in alcohol. So they can sell the alcohol, but they typically are drinking it. We are seeing phenomenal rates of fetal alcohol syndrome there. There are some villages in what was the former Soviet Union where we have really a lowered IQ because the entire population really has some level of alcohol-related birth defects. There's just been so much alcohol consumption. So it really is, it is a very serious problem in many parts of the world, even more than here. What I wanted to ask actually on this is, well, we'll get to it in a minute. But alcohol action actually does the same thing. It stimulates dopamine, it stimulates serotonin to reduce the anxiety, it lowers inhibition in anxiety, and it stimulates endorphins. So it has a lot of very positive effects in terms of what we would want to have as a way of being in the world. But we have a lot of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, FASD, and what we know now for sure is that there is no safe level of alcohol consumption during pregnancy. I guess I want to ask before I proceed to this with any depth is how many of you have had classes on fetal alcohol syndrome? Okay, very few. Okay. Do you know if you have a medical center in Montana that assesses FAS to look at fetal alcohol? You do. Do you know where that would be?
A lot of times you can use Shover, and they'll do like genetic testing to kind of give you an idea of what you may be looking at.
Where was that? I'm sorry?
Shover is out of Helena.
Okay.
And then they can come to different parts of the state.
Okay.
Anytime that they have contracts with.
That's great, because there's a real need to understand. We miss a lot of cases, I believe, of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, and it has a lot of negative developmental sequelae, right? This is a whole range of disorders. I've actually been in delivery rooms where we have the whiskey bottles, the amniotic fluid, as soon as the water bursts, just smells like a whiskey bottle. The entire labor and delivery room just absolutely reek. And you'll have situations where, I mean, so alcohol is the only drug that we're talking about here that is a teratogen. So how many of you know what a teratogen is? Okay, okay, yeah. Okay, teratogen, yeah.
Definitely.
Okay, you've heard the phrase?
Yes.
Okay, so some of you might remember thalidomide as a drug that was used to quell nausea during early stages of pregnancy, and it was given to a lot of women around the world. And it turns out that it's a teratogen, and so it resulted in a lot of birth defects where children were born with flippers, reduced limbs, and basically what a teratogen is it causes cell dysmorphology. Okay, so what that means is that, and this is significant because not any of the other substances that we're talking about do this. This means like misshaped miss, right? And morphology is shape. So it actually causes a cell. These are cells, and that's how our body communicates everything from one cell to another. Depending if this is a liver or a kidney, they all have different functions. And stem cells are omnipotent, so they can change into whatever. But if that cell is misshapen through a teratogen, so there can be chemicals that are teratogens, but the only drug that we're talking about here today that's a teratogen is alcohol. And it is basically a pickling agent. You guys all know that, right? So that is what happens and think about blood alcohol levels. If I'm a 200-pound man drinking a six-pack, my blood alcohol level will be, I don't know what it will be, but if that's what I'm drinking, it depends, I guess, on the potency of the beer. But if I'm a 100-pound female drinking a six-pack, or I'm an 8-pound fetus drinking a six-pack, and what you need to recognize is that you will have different blood alcohol concentrations, right? And what you should all know is that, in fact, while the fetus doesn't necessarily drink the beer, some of that gets into the bloodstream and does pass into the fetal compartment. And at about midway through pregnancy, the fetus begins drinking the amniotic fluid. And it actually starts learning, the kidneys learn how to process things. That's how the fetus begins developing. And that's why the fetus can have a bowel movement, right? And poop, right? And so when you have that happening, you can have a fetus that is actually deeply affected and has a higher tolerance for alcohol, even before they're born, because they have already had prenatal exposure. And it can range all the way from fetal alcohol syndrome to no effect, and that part of that is a genetic penetrance. The genetic development of that child is different. Sometimes we'll have fraternal twins that have, or sometimes we've even had twins that have different parents, different fathers, and you'll end up seeing, that's rare, but that happens, and then you'll see that there's really a different outcome when there's fetal exposure to alcohol. So I would encourage you to just be aware of this when you're working with your children, and also some of your clients may well be along the spectrum, right? They may have had this exposure prenatally, and it can have lifelong effects. It was first, maybe some of you remember this, before 1973, when we had a kid that was born with fetal alcohol syndrome, we said, I think we've got an FLK. Somebody come here and look at this FLK. Anybody know what FLK stands for? Funny looking kid. Yeah, we all said, oh my God, we got another FLK. And it was like everyone could see that something was funny, but we didn't know what was going on. They were called FLKs. And then in 1973, and why I will mention this is because FAS was discovered in France by a guy named Lemoine in Lyon. And what I think I want to put to rest is the idea that everyone around the rest of the world can drink wine and beer and alcohol without having effects because they drink it all the time ubiquitously. But our problem is that we don't drink it all the time, and that's why our kids have alcohol problems. That's not true. There are many, many, many fetal alcohol syndrome cases in France. Lots of alcoholics sitting out there at 10 o'clock in the morning in their little charming French cafes, getting drunk out of their mind at 10 o'clock. So it's not, the action of, I'm just telling you, I've lived in a lot of different places, and alcoholics are alcoholics. It affects our body in the same way. And indeed, there are ways to use alcohol responsibly. Most of the world doesn't do that. It really does descend pretty fast into alcoholism if you're using it a lot. And so the fact that FAS was described through a series of cases of FLKs in 1973, David Smith in San Diego identified it here at about the same time, and now we recognize it as an increased susceptibility to chemical dependency, lots of learning disabilities, many undiagnosed adults, and some of those might be your clients. And the reason that's relevant is because they may have more limited mental capacity and other physical health risks than you recognize. These are some of the classic FAS physical features. You actually need somebody that knows how to do anthropometry, which is like the measurement of facial features, and in order to be able to really diagnose this. But you'll have joint dysplasia. You have this smooth philtrum, a flat midline, small head, flat nasal bridge. One of the problems with this, and many of our diagnostics on FAS, is that most medical textbooks throughout the world are still normed on Caucasians. They are not normed on African Americans, Latinos, First Peoples. So what we really miss a lot of cases of African Americans or Asian Pacific Islanders or tribal Native Americans because we don't really know what we're looking for. And so there are some excellent diagnosticians, and Stripes at University of Washington is probably the best. But there's a lot of really good work being done on FAS and on diagnosis, even of adults, because they can run into problems with the law. They have poor judgment. The typical IQ is between 60 and 65 of a full-blown fetal alcohol syndrome case. Therefore, you're really ending up in need of support in order to help them manage. And certainly, if they run into drug problems themselves, they're going to end up with some real problems with the law oftentimes, and then they can't really get out of it. The first case of capital punishment in California when it was reinstated in 1992, was of a child, Robert Alton Harris. He was in his late 20s. He'd been in about 14 foster placements. He had full-blown FAS. His mother died when he was 5, and he had killed somebody at the behest of his brother. The other thing to know about alcohol, and I just think this is important because we don't always follow this in families, is that if I'm an alcoholic and I drink a 6-pack a day, my first child may be less impacted than my next child. What we call the maternal compartment will take a lot of the hit, and that's true with substance abuse as well. If I'm a cocaine user and I'm using and I'm pregnant, I might absorb a lot of it, but by the time I have my second or third pregnancy, those offspring are going to be more heavily impacted because my ability to tolerate and to absorb some of that is going to be worn down. The maternal compartment is going to take less of the hit, the fetal compartment is going to take more. And those children subsequently are going to be more affected. And we just have seen that a lot in our programs on perinatal substance treatment abuse programs where we have adverse impacts over time within families. So there's evidence of prenatal harm from all substances. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. But what we do know is that it's those crack babies that we worried about in the 1980s and 90s did not materialize. That, thank goodness, is not true. However, not everybody has, sort of emerged unscathed. What we do say is that there's increases in depression as they get older, actually. They seem to do less well than when they were younger. They have more ADHD, they have more depression, and this is Barry Lester, who is actually an excellent researcher and who did not want to find this outcome. He was really hoping this was all not true. And so over time, even as he controlled for a lot of the other factors, environmental support, social support, etc., it ended up turning out that these kids do have a little bit more problems and therefore need more support. Doesn't mean that they are not going to do fine ultimately, but they need more support. So as we move through the benzodiazepine family, these are some of the Valium and Xanax are prescription medications, Ambien and Lunesta. These can be really dangerous. They produce long-term withdrawal. I think some of you were in the session this morning that was on the prescription drug abuse, where she talked about this family as being quite problematic because you can go into deep sedation. It definitely reduces respiration and is highly addictive and is produced, or excuse me, and is prescribed tremendously in this country. Oops. Opioids encompasses the entire family of opiates, and I think I think people are using the term opioids more often now, but there really are the opiates, which are the natural opiates that are derived from morphine and codeine. The semi-synthetics are modified natural substances, which are heroin, Vicodin, for example. And then the synthetic opiates that are chemically manufactured. Right now, we've had and I don't know, I understand that you do have an opiate problem here in Montana, and that's more in Missoula than in other places. Is that accurate? Or is it kind of across the... So are you...
I think the overprescription of opiates and opioids is across the board.
Okay.
I don't know if one area is more so than the other, but more rural. What's amazing is some of these rural areas in Montana have some horrific drug issues that are not seen in other places. I mean, and that's where the resources are just not there.
Are so hard to get to them, right? The treatment programs and the distances are difficult. So we've had a big, in Southern California, had a big dump of fentanyl, which were from apparently from Chinese manufacturers that were coming in, and they were actually manufactured in there with Chinese, machinery and drugs, etc. But fentanyl is a very potent opiate that can cause overdoses pretty quickly, and so I guess you're going to be having other sessions on naloxone later on in the week here, which is great. get to that in a minute, but it's important that people all be aware of that and that you be able to respond to it appropriately. So opioids are operating in the same fashion. They are flooding your system with dopamine and are shutting down your capacity to produce your own dopamine ultimately, and then you end up in a withdrawal situation. But again, what we really have happening here is two overlapping epidemics. It's the prescription opioid pain reliever and the heroin. And since I work a lot with military veterans, we're very aware in the VA that there have been huge numbers of overdoses. Some of those are intentional, some of them are not intentional in terms of the suicides that are achieved through overdose. So about last, it was actually April of 2015, that guidance came out from the federal VA that they needed to reduce prescriptions of opiates, pain relievers, by 80% by December of 2015, which was a huge drop in prescription writing. Unfortunately, they didn't have commensurate treatment programs in place, which ended up, as you've probably seen here and in other places, it ended up really creating a movement to the street drugs, and so a lot of our veterans turned to heroin. So we really had this illicit surge in heroin as well, with overdose deaths being through the roof. Actually, I'm going to get to that because our military itself is dispensing so many psychotropic meds while people are in combat theater. I mean, I've got a chart here, we'll get to that, but that means they're coming back with a lot of stuff on board already, and then the VA doesn't have enough treatment in terms of therapeutic responses to PTSD. So actually, some of you may know this, but John Baio from the Baio Clinic said the only winner in war is medicine. And I really think that's true. We are learning a lot about PTSD, about traumatic brain injury, about chronic pain, and for our veterans, but even for a lot of your population, I would guess. The triad that you're really looking at and that you're dealing with is chronic pain, PTSD, and traumatic brain injury. Right now, the CDC, if they want to go anywhere to do, the Center for Disease Control, to do a study on concussions or mild traumatic brain injuries, where do you think they would look first if they're looking for it? Where do they go to find the population? No, they don't. Outside the military.
Outside football.
Football's one of them. Another place that's even more ubiquitous, juvenile halls and our jails. Just think about it. I mean, pretty much everybody in your juvenile hall or your jails has been thrown around, right? Whether it's in the back of a police wagon or whether they're a victim of domestic violence, their heads are banged against walls, or whether they're a perpetrator, they're falling downstairs, they have MTBIs, mild traumatic brain injury. Those three things together all exacerbate each other. TBI, PTSD, and the chronic pain. And musculoskeletal injuries are huge in all of our service members, but that is, a lot of us have musculoskeletal injuries one way or another. We broke things when we were little kids or on skateboards or whatever. We have some sort of joint, neck, bone problems. Partly even our lifestyle sets us up to be having those kinds of problems. And overlaying all three of those things is substance use disorders. We self-medicate in one way or another to manage all of those things, and they all exacerbate each other. And there's this really, I think, fabulous book that I'll circulate around here if you want to look at it. This is all free of charge, too, if you just want to write for it. It's called Co-Occurring Conditions Toolkit, Mild Traumatic Brain Injury and Psychological Health. And the underlying piece throughout it is substance use. So I will just pass this around. Another book that I've used a lot, just with law enforcement effort, is around drug identification. If any of you do home visits, it's worth its weight in gold. Or if you want to look at what's happening in your client's pockets or whatever, it just has got some interesting drug identification issues. But the the Defense Center for Excellence has got a lot of really, really great work on substance use because they, in fact, are dealing with a real epidemic in our veteran and military populations. Chronic pain is a major problem in that population. In fact, PTSD, neither PTSD nor TBI is the biggest injury. It's musculoskeletal injuries, and a lot of them are feet injuries. actually, because they're carrying about 100 pounds of weight. And a lot of our women have pelvic injuries and feet injuries, hammer toes, which can be very painful. You don't really think about your feet until you have feet problems, but that can be a major source of pain and disability and inability to exercise and do the kinds of things that you need to do. So musculoskeletal injuries are number one among our veterans. But the heroin action, just to get to this again, we're going to get through this, is analgesia. It changes your pain perception, so it reduces your perception of pain. The pain may still be there. So this is actually not always a good thing. Pain is actually an important thing to notice. And what I worry about a little bit is that we might minimize chronic pain in our populations. We really want to treat it, but we don't want to treat it with narcotics. We know for sure that that's not the best way to do it. That over-the-counter medication, even acetaminophen and ibuprofen are better at dealing with chronic pain. Narcotics are good for dealing with acute pain, but not much more than that. They're bad after that because you develop tolerance, and so they actually counter their own effects. But they also cause respiratory depression, cough suppression, they cause nausea, vomiting, constipation. The intense euphoria is really what leads to the addiction. All of these things can happen, and then you can end up with very nasty withdrawal symptoms. I came into this work because I was working with traditional midwives in West Africa. It sounds very weird, why did I do that? But I was working with healthy babies in West Africa with traditional midwives, and then I ended up working in Martin Luther King Hospital, where we had 500 positive toxicology screens a day, a year. Pardon me, a year, and in the late 1980s, and we didn't have any treatment programs, so we were removing children right and left from a mom with a positive toxicology screen. It was mostly cocaine, but we had a lot of neonatal abstinence in it as well from heroin. And now we have as many neonatal abstinence syndrome cases as we did in the late 80s and early 90s, but we don't have drug babies on the front page of Time magazine as we did then. Nothing has changed actually in terms of the incidence. We're managing it better, a little bit better, but we still don't have enough treatment programs for women. And we still have women not getting the kind of care that they need. We still have a lot of babies being born in drug exposure. And we know that that kids can actually go through withdrawal when they're born. But these are the rates of heroin-related deaths. One of the things, I'm going to be candid politically, the reason I think it's getting a lot more attention is that what you see here is this dark bar is white non-Hispanics, age 18 to 44. Black is this kind of darker gray, and Hispanic is lighter. The difference between 2002 and 2011 is that we have a lot more mainstream Caucasians being affected by this epidemic, whereas in the past it was in our minority communities and it didn't get as much attention then. It became much more of it was a law enforcement issue and it was a law and order issue, which is why we ended up putting a lot of folks in prison. But now that we have a lot more Caucasians and mainstream folks being affected by it, we're finally addressing it. I mean, I guess I don't care what moves us to address it. We need to address it across the board. But I think that's been part of the impetus to be more serious and thoughtful about it.
Would you say, though, it's being addressed because of the Caucasians, they're addressing that issue right there, but they're not addressing in the Hispanics and the black communities the underlying...
Indeed. I mean, I think absolutely. I think we can't digress too much here, although you've obviously seen I'm willing to go pretty far in my digressions. But I do think that which side of the tracks you're on does make a big difference, and we certainly don't have a big change in equal access. Our publicly funded programs are still not doing what we know is good. One of the other things I'll ask you, what do we know? What do we know for sure will actually increase your natural endorphin levels? What will do it? And it's actually counter to one of the other major epidemics that we've got in this country right now. Exercise, right? Okay, so if you go to the Betty Ford treatment program or you go someplace, one of the first things they're going to tell you is they are swimming, they are walking, they are doing yoga, they are on the gym, they are learning alternative behaviors instead of drug-seeking behaviors. What do we do in our publicly funded programs? I mean, our kids can't even go outside to play. In some of our neighborhoods are just not safe. So we don't have that. We don't have the exercise. But one of the first things, I helped establish a program called Shields for Families in South Central. One of the first things we did was got leftover gym machines, equipment, and started doing walks around the block, to try to deal with weight loss or weight gain is one of the things that you see in methamphetamine recovery, right? They have this paradoxical kind of situation, but weight gain's a big issue. So those are all issues that we really need to work on. And I think that our treatment programs are not as good as they could be in our publicly funded programs because we're not using all the kind of state-of-the-art evidence. And that's, we do know that we can do better in this. So your point is well taken. And we need to keep working in that direction to make it more equally available to people. You've probably seen this. I don't need to repeat it. Just that there's this huge prescription increase. And we're having a problem with, let's see, I want to make sure I'm on time, having a problem with getting folks to stop writing prescriptions, but one of that is a problem with consumer education as well. We all need to be informed that the narcotics are not going to be necessarily our most appropriate solution to our problems. The oxycodone acts as the opioids do. There's a huge risk of stopping abruptly. Can cause a lot of major problems. Basically, the types of drug abusers, prescription drug abusers fall into two categories: those who are dependent on their prescribed meds, and those who use other kinds of drugs and then are dipping into the prescription drug abuse. These are. So I was trying to figure out where Montana fell on this. You're actually not in the worst situation. California, where I work most of the time, and you all are kind of in the same boat. In terms of rates of overdose drugs, this was in 2014. So there are places that I work. So I also work in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And one of the things that we're doing there in order to counter this is naloxone was just handed out to all of the faculty at the Boston University's Department of Public Health and public health schools and medical schools because we were finding people dying in the parking lots, literally turning blue, and it wasn't in the winter. And so naloxone was just given to everybody, and classes were mandatory for all faculty to learn how to use the naloxone to counter overdose deaths from heroin. So I know you've got a session later on here on naloxone. I'm going to just mention it right here again. Are you all aware that you have this in Montana? It's sold without a prescription at CVS and at Walgreens. And so even though it's a prescription drug, as of September 25th, 2015, you guys became one, as I understand it, one of the 14 states that allows it across the board. Is that right, Shelley?
Well, they say that's the case, but if you call those places, they don't.
They don't.
No, because I did some research into this about 2 months ago. And they said that's a misnomer. None of them have gotten the information on that yet. Again, that was about 2 months ago, but I don't think that's changed.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's being put out by SAMHSA and NIDA, that you are one of the states that has done this. So apparently there's a
SAMHSA was the one that made the referral for me and told me this, and then I started contacting the ones in Billings, and they're like, oh.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah.
I will keep my mouth shut about that. You were on the list. It looks like Montana's very progressive. So did they say why that was true?
They did not. I was really excited about it.
Yeah.
It would be worth, I suppose, following up. It's
Yeah,
been 2 months,
this was supposed to happen in September of 2015, about more than a year ago. That there was approval from the Montana Department of Health Services for this to be the case. So I thought, fabulous, because naloxone, do you all know what naloxone is? Okay, it basically is this drug that will absolutely reverse. It has no side effects. It has no effect if you are not on an opiate, right? And if you are in an opiate withdrawal, it will literally shut it off at that moment. And as that person comes back to life, even from turning blue and having no cardiac, having no pulse, you can be trying to get a pulse anywhere and you will not find one, and you give them this and they will come back to life. It is amazing. And it's quite shocking. And what will happen is the person will begin to have withdrawal symptoms quite soon, which will make them ill. However, they are not dead. And so it is also in many places it's being dispensed widely among the addict community, Skid Rows, et cetera, because they're giving it to each other. And you can save lives. And it's very important. It's already saved tens of thousands of lives. And in many places, it is absolutely distributed over the counter, especially for all first responders, all EMS, all treatment programs, anybody with a chemical dependent. So I will explore that, Shelley. It's really.
Sorry to be the bearer of bad
No,
news.
I'm glad to not be. Thank you for having me to stop misinforming things. But it used to only be available with an injection, where you would have to drop a dose and then inject. It now is a nasal rescue kit that's been approved by the FDA. And you just give a little puff into the nostrils, and the person, and if you give it about every 3 minutes, they don't revive, but it does typically work. So this is the nasal injector, and it's a small little kit, easy to use, just keep in your purse or your back pocket or something, and it's pretty amazing. I would, if you're having a problem with it, it's really worth, as a state, moving it forward. Marijuana, I'm going to move through these drugs. I promise I would get through. The problem is that it's really thanks to a lot of California hybridization, really good hydroponic farming. The marijuana out there today is about 5 to 20 times more potent than President Clinton didn't inhale. But it is a big problem for our young folks. It does cause fetal growth retardation. It does passive placenta. One of the things that it also is a problem for, which you probably know or maybe don't know, that the window for schizophrenia is 17 to 24 years old. That's when about 98% of our cases of schizophrenia onset happen. And the potency of the marijuana today seems to actually be triggering quite a few initial schizophrenic episodes that then have been progressing more and more. So we're really seeing some evidence that this is a precursor to onset of schizophrenia. And schizophrenia is just like type 1 diabetes or whatever. You have to have a genetic component that would allow you to convert to that. Very oftentimes you need an insult. You need some environmental trigger that will kick on that gene that would move you down that path towards schizophrenia. And marijuana and other hallucinogenic substances seem to be some of those. And also, a lot of the marijuana may still be sprayed with something else or overlaid with something else that's a problem. Shelley, are we done on time here, or what's our time?
We're on the minute here, so yeah.
Okay, very close. Okay, I am going to just, I apologize, I have my time wrong. Marijuana edibles, you guys probably know this is a big challenge. We're having a lot more poisonings, and this is one of my real worries. But these are actually real packaged marijuana candies. The problem is that if you look on the back of them, they say the serving size on each one of these little ones is 4. Well, no one is going to eat a quarter of one of these things. So they have a lot of overdoses and end up with a lot of cardiac problems and other poisonings. It's a real challenge. I'm going to move really fast here. This is a big problem. The honey oil butane extraction is sort of like our new version of meth labs, where with precursor chemicals and things kind of exploding using really problematic chemicals. Meth, we've already talked about it, so I'm going to just move quickly, except that meth labs, I want to just mention to you, if you're in a meth lab, the chemicals that are in a meth lab tend to be lighter than air. So it's your trash cans and things that are going to be pretty heavily contaminated, and unfortunately that's the level at children, little ones, to the age of 5, respire about 30 times more rapidly than you and I do. So they're at a level where they may be taking in a lot more of the substance. So if you have a kid coming out of a meth home, you actually want to have them evaluated for upper respiratory issues. It's a really good idea. you're bringing them to foster care or you're putting them someplace, they should be evaluated before you're placing them someplace else. Just as an FYI, bath salts and spice, I think you got whole sessions on these, so I'm grateful that someone else will cover it. Synthetic cannabinoids, I want to get to this site. I just wanted to mention this, that we really do see this increased problem. And this is the formulary of psychotropic meds that are being, this is from the Combat Operation Behavioral Health textbook from the U.S. Army. These are the medications that are being distributed in theater and by prescribing psychologists. The military DoD is the only group in the country that has prescribing psychologists. And so some of these, as you recognize, are pretty heavy duty medications. I was shocked when I saw this because it just seems like it's pretty intense. And so this can be, this is a psychiatric criminal that is in theater for deployment while they're in theater. I think I've said that 3 times now. But they can therefore, some of these, if you come off them, if you're not tapered off, you can have a really bad withdrawal. Some of them are pretty dangerous. And then if you're coming back into the country with having had these on board, it may be more challenging for you to sort of just segue nicely into general civilian life without other kinds of problems. So I think I would want to be asking all of the folks in front of you or in your groups if they have service members or National Guard or reservists or veterans and challenges they might be experiencing. Just concluding that the drug and alcohol habits really are a family disease. We have a lot of challenges that we see with sometimes we place children with the grandparents in family kinship care. We find that mom didn't fall too far from the tree and that grandma's not such a great place to put the kids. And so we really see these intergenerational challenges that I think we need to continue to work with. A lot of domestic violence in these homes. I'm not going to continue on here because I want to close it out for you guys, but I know there's another session on ACEs, and I just wanted to mention that I think the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, is a really great one for you all to look into. And if you haven't looked at it, there's an entire website that will give you access to the ACEs programming. How many of you have heard of the ACEs, by the way? Okay, great. All right, wonderful. Okay, terrific. Then I'm glad for that because I do think that this entire set of questions can be very informative, and I know you have another session on that here, or actually you had it this morning, actually. And I think it can be really helpful as you're working to help your clients recover. So I think this is the end of our program, and thank you, Shauna.